Okay, welcome back. We're going to take a look at the rest of the content library configuration. Once you've created a local library, by the way, what are you going to do? You're going to probably want to put some images in that content library, right? So populating content libraries. There are several methods for doing this. You can clone a VM right into the content library. You can clone a VM to a template into the content library. You can clone a template from the vSphere inventory or from another content library into the content library. You can clone a VApp. You can import a template from a URL. You can even import an OVF file from your local file system. So several ways to get the items into the content library. And you can actually perform these either from the items themselves, kind of like a push operation, or you can actually do it from within the content library where you pull the content in. It is very simple to set these processes up. Here we'll show you that once you have items in your content library, then how would you start deploying VMs from these content library items? If you were to create a VM from scratch, right, you typically right-click on the place you want the VM to be deployed, like on an ESX server in this case, or probably more likely put it in the cluster, or right-click on the cluster. Specify a new virtual machine, but instead of creating a new VM from scratch, you select deploy from a template, and you can then choose from where you're going to get this template, right? So you choose this from your content library. You can also create a VM and mount an ISO image from the content library. If you happen to put an ISO image into the content library, you can mount an ISO image into a VM that has just been created, for instance, and use the content library as a source for hosting your ISO images. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat with that. The data store on which the ISO image is located, which is of course where your content library is, has to be associated with the ESX server that's going to then mount the ISO for their virtual machine. So this actually has some limitations. This works with just the VMs that are in the same vCenter as the local library. That's because that's where the host that holds the ISO image is located. Now, updating a content library item. If you've got the local library, you can, well, if you're in the vCenter that's hosting the local library, you can also update items in that content library. You can directly update a VM template, for instance. You can add a patch to it. You can, in fact, even delete items from the existing template, create a new one. These are all things that can be adjusted in the local library. If it's been published, same thing. You can update a local library, whether it's been published or not. What you can't do is update items in a subscriber library. So speaking of which, if you've actually taken a local library and have published it, well, then it's available for subscription. So you publish it by simply going back into the edit settings of your local library, and you can select to publish it. If you are in the process of creating the local library and you decide to publish it at that point, what it's going to do is going to provide you with a subscription URL. Right, the subscription URL will represent the local library's published URL with a JSON-based address. So you can copy that link and then copy and paste it into an email message to send it to the person who's administering the remote library who needs to subscribe by pointing their vCenter subscriber library request to this URL. If you've added credentials in the local library's published settings, then you will need to also ensure you put the same credentials on the subscriber library. So again, if you're only publishing it with credentials, then you'll need to subscribe with the same credentials. So the process of subscribing is simply that you tell the system you would like to create a subscriber library, paste the subscription URL, enable authentication will let us adjust what the credentials are, and then notice the download content setting. You can have it download content immediately, where it will go ahead and actually pull all the file content down, or only when needed. The difference there is that when it's selected to when needed, what will happen is the subscriber library will only recognize the metadata of the contents that are in the published library without actually downloading the content to save space. If, on the other hand, you chose immediately, well, then it will download the entire contents of the published library so that the two libraries are in full sync at the data level. But then that doesn't save a lot of space, but it really all depends on what your preferences are. If you wanted to ensure everything has already been seeded at the subscriber library, and then updates will only need to be, what metadata changes have occurred. Again, it may not actually download all the changes, just the metadata that there have been some changes. So you can tell on the subscriber library that items have actually been updated in the published library. And if you need the latest copy, you can tell it to do the synchronization when needed. So one thing about the published and subscriber library communication, there's actually a couple services involved in managing content library. There's something known as the content library service, and then there's something called the transfer service. Essentially, the content library service is the process that sets up the subscription connection. The content library service on the subscriber library will then use the content library service on the published library to establish the connection based on the URL that the published library had generated to make its data available to be subscribed to. Once that process has completed, then the transfer service takes care of the synchronization. And that's where this can be quite different depending on where you've placed your content library. If you place your content library in the vCenter server based file system, so it's in some kind of NFS location most likely, then it's this transfer service who's doing the synchronization. If, on the other hand, you had placed the content library on an ESX server data store, notice the example here. If you've got enhanced link mode, this is where it makes sense. If you have enhanced link mode, you've got your two vCenter servers linked together using enhanced link mode, the vCenter server that is publishing versus the vCenter server that is subscribing, if you actually have both the subscriber library and the published library on ESX server-based data stores, the synchronization is actually from host to host, bypassing the vCenter server in the synchronization, which actually reduces a lot of overhead. Whereas if you had actually placed the content library in a vCenter server accessible folder, then you're also including the vCenter server services in the synchronization. However, if you don't have enhanced link mode, then it's the example on the right. With enhanced link mode, you have this great host-to-host authentication capability. Without enhanced link mode, well, then what will happen, even though the ESX servers have the content library on their data stores, the vCenter servers will actually have to fully copy the data over the network from the hosts with their data stores, synchronize that between the two vCenter servers, and then saving it on the destination's data store. So that's going to involve a bit more overhead. This is where having an environment which does not have enhanced link mode, if you've optimized this for streaming purposes, right? You have the published library that's been optimized selection. Well, then this reduces that overhead, and that's where the optimized actually works best, is when you don't have enhanced link mode. As far as content library maximums, as you can see listed here, the max content library size is 1 terabyte. Total library items is 1,000. Total library items per vCenter server instance across all the libraries is 2,000. 16 concurrent sync operations on the published library's vCenter server instance, and the total number of libraries per vCenter server instance is also 1,000. So take a look at how we do this in this exercise. You'll do a lab number 14 here. You'll go ahead and create a content library. We have our two vCenter servers, right? We've got vCenter A, we have vCenter B. So we're going to have the vCenter A be the local library that will be published. So we're going to go ahead and create a local library, place some VM data. We have a sample VM that you're going to place in there. You'll create a subscribe content library on the site B vCenter, create a subscription on the original local library for VM templates. This creates that two-way synchronization so that we'll see cloning a template to the local library and synchronizing that between your two libraries, and to see how this process works. And then we'll have you deploy a VM from the subscribe content library, since now that the data has been brought over to the subscriber side. So take a look at this exercise. We've now explained the purpose of content libraries in vSphere, identified the vSphere requirements for content libraries, created a local content library, show you how to subscribe to a published content library, and deploy VMs from a content library. So go perform the lab exercise, and we'll see you in the next lesson.